Okay, so I'm going to talk more or less about the same issue. Our our papers are quite they're not exactly overlapping, but they're really close to each other. But it is my paper is more about what determines the terms of contract between regular forces and pro-government militias. So there is quite a big body of theory now being produced on pro-government militias as a phenomenon. And most of that theory is about the political relationship, and especially about why governments outsource some of the use of violence to pro-government militias. But there's less writing on this topic in terms of exactly how do regular forces and pro-government militias interact in combat. So that's what I'm trying to make a contribution. And I mean, like I guess many of you, my background is in area studies. I'm an area study expert, and my relationship to theory so far, or mostly, is about using theory to make my empirical analysis better. So this is from my point of view, this is a very kind of rare example where I try to do the opposite. I'm trying to find out something from the case of the Ukrainian volunteer battalions that maybe may have some more general um, relevance. So we'll see about that. But anyway, that's the ambition for the program. I just comment on the picture so you know. A lot of the paper is based on interviews with heads of volunteer battalions and also fighters in the volunteer battalions. So the top picture is my colleague Christian and I in west of Mariupol last year when we visited the Azov battalion at their bases west of Mariupol. And the lower picture is when we visited the Dnipro 1 battalion at the same time in Dnipro. There is also some written empirical data that you can find on them, but not that much. So interviews are kind of important in this matter. So what I argue in the paper is that, and this is borrowed from principal agent theory, you can say that, or you can characterize relationships between regular armed forces and pro-government militias as either trust-based or sanction-based. And sanction here means not just punishing, but also monitoring and to some extent combat subordination or command subordination. And I argue in the article that the terms of contract between the Ukrainian volunteer battalions and the regular structures, armed forces, that is both the armed forces and National Guard, in the end came out as a mostly trust-based contract. And then I tried to argue why, how that came to be about, or the reasons for that. So trust-based in the Ukrainian case here means that from the government side that the battalions accepted government leadership as a principle. You can question to some extent whether that is the case with Pravy Sector, but most of the others did. And the battalions also, and this is quite important, most of them waited for government sanction before engaging in operations. This is very clearly seen, for example, when Azov retook Mariupol, where they had the operation planned quite a long time before the operation actually commenced, but where they were just sitting waiting for the go-ahead from Kiev. What makes me say that this is a trust-based contract is that the battalions reserved for themselves and were accepted that they did not take part in operations they disagree with. So if they were asked to take part in the operation and they didn't think this was a good idea, they said, no, we will not be part of that operation. A regular unit can, of course, not do that. They accepted operational subordination, but they maintained tactical autonomy during combat. So they would submit to the commander of our operation, but in terms of actually conducting the fighting, they decided for themselves how to do that. I should maybe insert here, do you know the difference between strategic, operational, and tactical? This is kind of very military terms, but strategic means how to use military force to achieve the political goals that you have. Tactical is on the other side and means how to win particular battles. And operational is in between there and concerns when to engage the enemy, when not to engage the enemy, where to engage the enemy, and so on. So there are 3 levels. So that's kind of background for what I'm saying. And the third thing that makes me say that the volunteer battalions had a trust-based contract with the regular forces was that volunteers could exit the battlefield at any moment, even during operations. So not just before operations, but even during operations, when if they find out that this is not for them, they could just leave. That's how I argue that it is was mostly a trust-based contract. And then I try to explain why. So this is the framework for explanation at the moment. I identified three what I call independent variables. That is the degree of agenda overlap. It is the element of bottom-up versus top-down organization. And it is how strong or how important the battalions were, or the pro-government militias were, when hostilities started. So I argue that from the case of the Ukrainian volunteer battalions, if you have a high value on all of those three independent variables, you will most likely get a trust-based accountability contract. And then I try to insert mechanisms in between that. So how did a high degree of agenda overlap actually lead to a trust-based accountability? Well, this was mostly a case of performance interdependence, which means that in many of the battles, very many of the battles actually, the pro-government militias or the battalions and the regular forces fought together. So it's just not possible to say whose contribution, who contributed the most to either success or failure. And it's very difficult to have a sanction-based system when you cannot say whether the one you have outsourced the violence to, whether it was he who was the source of the failure or whether it was your own forces. So that makes it more difficult to have a sanction-based system. And then I argue that the strong element of bottom-up organization with the battalion led to a feeling of entitlement on the part of the battalions. They said that we have had all these military successes, so don't come here and try to command us, because we are entitled to independence or to autonomy because we have had these successes. And this was actually to some extent reflected on the government side. So you will have representatives of the army, representatives of the National Guard saying that in principle, we would have liked to control the battalions much more, but they, by merit, and this is a quote, by merit, had the right to their own opinion and to rule themselves to some extent. And the final point is that it's what I call institutional lock-in, which is borrowed from another area of social science. But the idea here is that, well, it's a little bit like one argues with a marriage, that what the terms of contract that you negotiate in the very first months of the marriage have a tendency to last throughout the marriage. And this is in a sense the same thing here, that because the battalions were so strong in the very beginning, it was very difficult to reduce their role later. So a more concrete example would be that initially the battalions were not supposed to have heavy armory. They were only supposed to have small arms. But when the fighting started in the east, to some extent, the regular structures actually had to give the battalion heavy armory, because the military and the National Guard themselves were not either willing or able to use it. And once you had given, for example, Azov main battle tanks and armored personnel vehicles, it's very and they have used it to good effect. It's actually very difficult to take it back. So things that happened in the beginning tended to stick. So all that together created what I call the trust-based accountability contract form. Thank you.